It's Wednesday, November 6th, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, we're talking about a hot new trend sweeping the nation, and it seems to have finally arrived here at Michigan State. Is it a fashion fad or hip music? No. It's a set of formal policies colleges across the country have adopted to govern how they handle political issues. Please, don't stop listening. I know, that's kind of, but this is an important issue. It has a lot of ramifications for you if you're a student or a faculty member at Michigan State. And I've got a great guest who's going to talk us through it in a way that I hope is not boring. Owen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I want you to carry that responsibility as we go through the rest of the show. I want you to do this in a way that's interesting for people. Can you do that?
Feels like a little bit of pressure that you're throwing on me, but I'm ready to go. I think I can rise to
I think
the
it's going to be a
challenge.
great show. I've got an upper respiratory infection. The urgent care tells me, so it might not sound if you're.
You seem sharp. You seem sharp as ever.
That's good.
Dressed and sharp.
I feel mildly sharp.
Great watch.
Yeah. Ooh, great watch. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask you this. So these policies, they call them institutional neutrality, which I think is objectively a cool sounding name, but also kind of a confusing name.
Yeah.
Can you tell me? We're about to throw that around like 100 times for the rest of the show. What is institutional neutrality? Walk me through it.
Institutional neutrality is relatively simple. Basically, what it means is that universities and leaders speaking on behalf of universities are not going to take a stance on political issues. That's the idea. And sort of the benefit, people will say that, well, not even people will say, it did, institutional neutrality originated at the University of Chicago in the late 60s, right? And so they sort of conceived this at this center they have there called the Forum of Free Inquiry and Expression, right? Yeah. And it still exists today. We went straight to the source, right? We talked to this guy who's the director there, Tom Ginsburg, and he basically laid out for us that the benefit of universities and the leaders not taking stances on political issues is that, the more they stay out of discourse, they're supporting the free expression of all of the scholars within the institution, right? If institutions don't take stances, faculty are most free to develop and advocate for their own, right? That's sort of the argument there.
And he put it, I think, in an interesting way where people hear institutional neutrality, they hear like colleges can't have political opinions, and it sounds a little bit censorship-y. And people do believe that. But his argument is that basically like if the college itself doesn't have opinions, then the faculty within it are free to have whatever opinions they want, especially those that are sort of dissenting, that would be in disagreement with the majority. But of course, institutional neutrality has its critics, and I think what we've seen as it's become, very hip in the last year or so, is that it's actually very tricky in practice. It conceptually is great, but colleges have run into a lot of problems with because it's hard to be neutral, right? Like, people argue that every action is political.
Yes.
And so it's a very kind of thorny area that colleges have moved into. And our story is about sort of the ways that MSU has gotten there. Yeah. But can you tell me, talk me through, in the last couple of years, right? MSU has not had a policy like this. Has MSU been weighing in on political issues?
It sure has. Take, for example, when the January 6th riot happened in 2021, there was a statement. It came from Sam Stanley, the president at the time. Yeah. There have been statements on sort of like the police killings kind of in this around 2020 and sort of like the Black Lives Matter movement and kind of this all the social unrest that was going on there.
Statement about, I think, Russian invasion of Ukraine was another one. MSU has weighed in on many of these issues.
It absolutely has on very decidedly no gray area that they were political issues, and MSU has weighed in there.
And that's something that Tom Ginsburg, actually, from U Chicago, was telling us about, is that he feels like for a long time, colleges maybe didn't necessarily need a policy of neutrality because they weren't weighing in on things. But in the last 10 years, he said it's become, MSU is definitely not out of the ordinary. It became very common for when something happens, colleges to put out a statement saying we find this appalling, or we support this, we don't support this, especially in the context of social justice. The way that he framed it in our conversation was that social justice advocates have said that sort of silence is violence, like the phrase that he said. And so colleges have felt the need to weigh in. But in the last year, there's been a shift, right? Yeah. And institutional neutrality has kind of become all the rage. University of Michigan, for example, just adopted a policy. Yeah. And they're almost late to the party, if you think of it that way. So tell me about, what about the last year has pushed colleges to reconsider these statements and get into the institutional neutrality game?
Right. It's been ever since October 7th, Hamas's attack on Israel. Ever since, and then the subsequent war, it's become an issue that kind of, I think, what colleges would say, what universities would say is, no matter what we say, there is no way to make everyone happy. It's too thorny of an issue. And so, whereas with the last couple years, MSU and other institutions have sort of like almost succumbed in a way to this kind of like silence is violence argument, like we need to say something. With this issue, with Israel and Hamas and the war, it's become, again, we're not going to say anything because we can't make anybody happy.
Well, and it's like, I think you have very loud groups on both sides of this issue. And at least this is what Tom Ginsburg said when we talked to him from UChicago, was that like in summer 2020, right, a college could put out a statement saying like, we're against racism. And there were not like various factions on different sides of that issue that had like some legitimate claims and that would cause some controversy and protests on campus.
Right.
Now colleges are in a much more complicated predicament. They have like big groups on both sides of an issue that want to see them say one thing or another. And so I think institutional neutrality, they've sort of been able to absolve themselves, I guess, of that responsibility.
I think absolve, that's a great word for it,
But anyway, so the story that we wrote was about how MSU doesn't have an institutional neutrality policy formally, but they've been acting like they do. And we have a couple great examples in this story of the things. I want you to tell me first about this communications plan. It's the anniversary of October 7th, 1 year since this attack in Israel that started this, very heated debate on campus. And they send out this plan to a bunch of campus leaders. What does it say?
Yeah, so exactly. This was a 1 year anniversary of October 7th communications plan, and it was sent specifically, we're talking college deans, program directors, department chairs. And it's sort of just offering guidance on, as an institution, here is sort of our line. Here's how we should be thinking about this, how we should be talking about it. And it explicitly says, there's a heading there that says tone. It says empathy. It says then neutrality. It says MSU pretty explicitly. Neutrality is our tone. MSU does not take a stance on political issues. So that was kind of the big kind of signal there that this neutrality thing is something that MSU is legitimately incorporating.
And so then the rest of our story was about a couple of cases we found where academic units at MSU have gone sort of against that guidance and made statements that were very much not neutral, and what happened after that. Tell me, first about, what they call them department statements. Can you explain what that is? And then let's talk about those examples we found of departments skewing from that neutrality guidance.
Yeah, and I think the timeline's important. Like, some of the statements we're going to talk about here were before this communications plan had been sent out, right? But sorry, with the new guidance though, it became a thing of like, oh, these department statements, maybe we have to rethink it. Okay, so basically what we're talking about is these are statements that are prominently featured. I don't know about prominently, but featured on the department websites. So if you were to look up MSU English Department, there's a tab there at the top, or has been in the past at least, a tab there that says, statements. Right? And you click on that, and you can look back and you'll see stuff on other issues. In the past, you will have seen there was a statement about a ceasefire, calling for a ceasefire, right? And that was on the English Department's website. We found out through our reporting that the provost basically came to the department and said, "Hey guys, that statement that's going against our neutrality thing, can we take that down?" Basically, and so that has happened at a couple other departments. Feelings are kind of mixed there among faculty about sort of what the ramifications of that are. But
well, and it's an interesting, as Ginsburg from UChicago was telling us, he said these kind of department statements are like a gray area that colleges enter, because colleges, or at least at MSU, based on their neutrality policy, I don't think they want to stop like the individual speech of faculty in their scholarship as like individual scholars, but a department statement is this kind of weird middle ground where it is just expressing the opinion of the undersigned members of a majority of the department.
Yep.
There can be dissenters and whatnot.
Yeah.
But it's on the department webpage,
It is.
and it's a
The MSU logo is going to be there when
and
you.
so it's like this in between of like, it's not an official statement on behalf of the university, but it's also not just individual faculty speech, and it's this kind of odd area. And we talk to people on both sides of this. I mean, the administration seems to believe pretty clearly that that constitutes some sort of institutional speech.
Yeah.
And violates the neutrality thing, and so they actually did take them down without even consulting the departments.
Right.
But then you talked to someone who is the chair of one of these departments that had a statement. They had a different view. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So this is the department called American Indian and Indigenous Studies Department. And I talked to the chair there. When we were working on this story, their statement, which was calling for a ceasefire, it was still up, but they were sort of in negotiations. They had been asked to take it down, basically. And sort of what this department chair argued to me is this statement, on the one hand, in her view, was not controversial. It was a statement for peace, is how she put it. She's saying, I want a ceasefire. I want the fighting, the dying to stop, or not just our department, that's what we want. And she sees that as inherently tied to what the work of the department is, because in a department like that, she said to me, when we're talking about American Indian and Indigenous Studies, we're necessarily talking about issues of land rights, right? And so I think sort of the implication there is like, obviously in Israel and in Palestine, that's a very integral part to the whole discussion.
Yeah.
And so she sort of saw it as like, this is inherently tied to our work. It's not really that controversial. And so she kind of felt like we should be able to have that expression. So yeah, that was sort of where she's coming from.
It is an interesting, because again, it's like how we talked about institutional neutrality. I think is very different when you describe it than when you put it into practice. You run into these complications.
Yeah.
If the soil sciences department put up a statement about gun control, that's an odd thing, right? But when you get into this conflict where you have someone like that who's arguing that, yes, it's a department statement, which MSU would say violates the institutional neutrality policy, but it relates so closely to the scholarship that then they can argue that it's almost an extension of the scholarship and thus should be protected.
Yeah.
And you get into these really complicated areas, and that I think is what is so interesting about institutional neutrality and why people should follow it closely, because we don't know how this is all going to shake out.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of where you draw the lines, and I think that's where we're at right now. And this department chair said to me, we should mention there is not an official institutional neutrality policy right now, but there is a page that anyone could see it. It's like called the Civil Discourse FAQs, and if you're paying attention to MSU, civil discourse has kind of been like the tagline that President Kevin.
It's been thrown around.
It's been thrown around.
It's a hip phrase right now.
It's definitely hip. And so if you look at these civil discourse FAQs, one of them is like, what can departments say? And there's this, and you open it up, and it says, the guidelines say, employees may not make personal statements unrelated to university business on behalf of the university using department websites. And so, the dean of this College of Arts and Letters, and the provost sort of had to tell this department chair, hey, the statement you guys have with the ceasefire, that's violating that. But then this person says, actually, it's not, because our department, this is university business. This is directly related to our department, what we're talking about here. It is an extension of the scholarship. So yeah, it's all about where we're going to draw the lines. And it's tough because there's not an official board policy yet. It's difficult. And that was the sense I got, is this department chair said, I want it to be more clearly defined, right?
Well, and I think that's work that our understanding is that that's being done, right? So the president has said that he is considering a formal policy. Like we're saying, everything we've talked about this far at MSU is this like communications guidance, a PDF made by the comms department, or a website put up by the provost office. But it's not like a formal policy enacted by the board of the university that's been debated in public and then voted on. And that is where it feels like we're headed, right? Because the president said that he's having discussions with the board about one of these policies. A lot of MSU's peers at other universities have had one of those. So it'll be interesting to see how precisely they draw that line, how long this policy is, how specific it is, if one does come together. Because it sounds like that's what some of these departments would like, is more clarity.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, like part of our kind of framing with the story is like, I think what the day before we published, or 2 days before University of Michigan, the school down the road, their board of regents, they passed one of those policies, right? So, and I think right now the number is somewhere like in the 20s in terms of institutions that have formally, with their board, adopted a policy of institutional neutrality.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting. And, you know, we're recording this on Tuesday. We don't know what's going to happen with the election. By the time it comes out on Wednesday, anything could be going on. MSU could be in an incredibly precarious political position, I guess. I don't know.
A precarious
and so I
political
wonder-
predicament?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you like the consonation there?
The PPP.
The PPP.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you know, we don't know what challenges MSU will face in the months to come and whatnot, even, you know, separate from this issue of Israel and Gaza. And so, you know, we're watching this closely. Will there be some sort of former policy? Yeah. I think we've had an interesting discussion about institutional neutrality. I think
Easy for
people
us to
learned
say,
a lot.
maybe, but
Guys like us might be more into it than the average 909
We
listener, but I hope that they're into it.
yeah.
I don't know. We don't know until they see
We
it.
want
but,
your feedback,
yeah,
community.
well, yeah,
Do we?
We do.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, they know how to write. My email's out there. Your email's out there.
Yeah, it sure is.
But yeah, I think we've had an informative discussion. I think people like it. And yeah, so that's all for this week. I'll be back next week with more great reporting. You can read the story that Owen and I wrote about institutional neutrality at statenews.com. Thank you, Owen, for coming on.
For having me.
Thank you, Taylor, our wonderful podcast coordinator. And most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.